Top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Olympic amateur standout on the eve of her professional debut, O'Shea Jones posted this to her Instagram account. It reads, "I don't train to be better than other people. I train to be the best me I can be because she's got to beat anybody that's in her way at 147 pounds. Here I come, 147 pounds. That is where Unbeaten Prospect Summerlin campaigns. That is where the reigning undisputed champion Jessica McCaskill holds all the belts, 147 pounds. That's where Mexico's own Alma Ibarra.
She campaigns there too.
With the arrival of O'Shea Jones to today's welterweight division, that's a division that's about to get a shot in the arm.
A serious one.
Ahead of last year's Olympics, I told you guys that whatever happens for those amateurs and for those Olympians, moving forward, these are fighters you want to watch out for because these are the next wave of fighters, the next generation of fighters that are going to be integrating themselves into the professional ranks. O'Shea Jones is one among them.
She just signed a split team management.
And she has the kind of amateur background that a lot of welterweights today don't have.
The kind of amateur background to where they might move her fast.
Amateur standouts like Katie Taylor,
Right.
Clarissa Shields, Vasyl Lomachenko.
Well, these are fighters that were moved fast in the pro ranks based on their amateur background.
And granted that these are all gold medalists, whereas O'Shea, she didn't get the gold in the Olympics, though all the same, she is an amateur standout. And I feel like this is a fighter that might be moved quick.
She hasn't made a pro debut yet, but she's about to.
Standing in at a very generous 5'8", 24 years old from out of Toledo, Ohio.
Very good dimensions for a welterweight.
And ripe, a very spry 24 years old. Years of upside. Her whole career is ahead of her in today's welterweight division. And I reiterate, she hasn't made her pro debut yet, but this is someone you want to watch out for.
Yet another amateur standout you want to watch out for.
Another fighter set to make her professional debut in the very near future, Australia's own Sky Nicolson posted this to her Twitter account. It reads, "Blessed to announce my professional debut on a huge card in San Diego, March 5th, live on DAZN Boxing. A big thank you to Eddie Hearn and Matchroom for this amazing opportunity. I'm chasing my dreams with everything I have." Sky Nicolson is one of several Aussie standouts, several Aussie fighters that Matchroom has signed. Brock Jarvis,
Dempsey McCain,
Liam Buttle, Ebony Bridges, Sky Nicholson. They've signed quite a few Australian fighters. Sky Nicholson is one among them, an amateur standout they very recently signed who is set to make her professional debut here in the US of A on March 5th.
She's going to be making her pro debut on the undercard of Chocolatito versus Estrada 3.
In what is being billed as a super featherweight contest, that's 130 pounds, against an opponent that has yet to be announced. And like a lot of fighters, when they go pro, they might debut at one weight and gradually move down inside a couple of fights. I don't imagine that Sky is going to...
I don't imagine she's going to campaign as a super featherweight henceforth.
I imagine she'll debut as a super featherweight, have a couple of fights there, one or two, and then maybe move down to featherweight.
It's 126 pounds. There's 3 champions there.
Unified featherweight champion of Puerto Rico, Amanda Serrano, Mexico's own Erica Cruz, and Denmark's own Sarah Mahfoud. Sky Nicholson, a southpaw, 26 years old, very young, whole career ahead of her, could really make a splash in the featherweight division.
And we've actually talked about that here on the channel.
Australia is a developing market, thus Matchroom has made it a point to sign a lot of Australian talent, a lot of Australian fighters, some amateur standouts, young fighters that have a high ceiling, exhibit a lot of upside, and have several years of their careers ahead of them. Sky Nicholson being one of those fighters. I could see her being a somebody, and I've said that before. I could see her.
It's a great card for her to make her pro debut here stateside.
On the undercard of Chocolatito versus Estrada 3, Chocolatito and Juan Francisco Estrada, two fighters we're all familiar with, in a fight that's set to go down Saturday, March 5th this year at the Pechanga Arena in San Diego, California. Like I said before, I'm looking forward to seeing what the buzz is all about. I'm looking forward to seeing Sky Nicholson's pro debut. And just in keeping with the theme of unbeaten prospects set to return to action, Top Rank's own unbeaten Puerto Rican sensation Edgar Berlanga is going to be taking on Steve Rolls in March on the 19th.
It's the same Steve Rolls that Gennady Golovkin fought.
Edgar Berlanga sports a professional record of 18 wins, no losses, no draws with 16 knockouts. And I maintain my original position that too much was made of Edgar's knockout streak, and that can cause a young fighter who's still developing to develop a false sense of confidence. Yeah, you're knocking these guys out, you are, but you're supposed to knock these guys out. You see what I mean?
The kind of guys you're knocking out.
The last time we saw Edgar Berlanga was on the undercard of Wilder vs. Fury 3. He took on Argentina's own Marcelo Coceres in that fight, and he didn't look good in that fight. That's the same Marcelo Coceres that was knocked out by Billy Joe Saunders, a non-puncher. So when you're billing a guy as a wrecking ball, a wrecking machine, a knockout guy that's knocking everybody out, everybody that's in front of him, when you're making so much of his knockout streak and that highlight reel, and he fails to knock out a guy that a non-puncher knocked out.
Well, you can imagine what the armchair critics are going to say.
You can imagine what the short-sighted and slack-jawed gawkers are going to make of this unbeaten prospect who you've spent all this time propping up on the premise that he's such a strong puncher, but he wasn't strong enough to knock out Marcelo Coceres. In that fight, he got dropped himself.
The fight left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths.
Now, being the level-headed fight fan that I am, I'm going to give Edgar the benefit of the doubt. And I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because I know that legendary fighters like Bernard Hopkins.
Remember him?
He actually lost his pro debut. Juan Manuel Marquez, he lost his pro debut as well. And with those things in mind, a young fighter who's still developing, like an Edgar Berlanga, he's allowed an off night. His off night was the Marcelo Coceres fight. He needs to be better against Steve Rolls.
You can forgive the Marcelo Coceres performance.
You can forgive that so long as he looks better, shows improvement against Steve Rolls. I reiterate, if Bernard Hopkins lost his professional debut and Juan Manuel Marquez along with him, but they still went on to be legendary fighters, it's not the end of the world that Edgar Berlanga looked less than perfect against Marcelo Coceres. But what he does need to do is show improvement.
Too much was made of his knockout streak.
And I feel like too much was made of his potential marquee value, the kind of people that he's rubbing elbows with, the likes of a Fat Joe and a Tracy Morgan. He seems in right with the right people, but it's his boxing that's going to take him places.
It's his boxing we're here to talk about.
It's his boxing that needs to improve. Edgar is going to be taking on Canada's own Steve Rolls. Steve Rolls, who has since gotten himself back in the winner's bracket after suffering his first professional loss to Gennady Golovkin roughly 2 years ago. We last saw Steve on the undercard of Rivas versus Rosicki in what was the inaugural Bridgerweight title fight. Steve Rolls fought on that undercard against Christopher Booker, and he racked up a 9th-round TKO over Booker and all of his awful-looking tattoos.
There ought to be a law.
It's not a bad opponent choice for Edgar Berlanga. 18-0 Edgar Berlanga.
Fighting a guy that Gennady Golovkin fought, that's all right.
As Steve Rolls, I'd say he's more or less on the same level of a Marcelo Coceres, so they haven't exactly taken their foot off the gas by matching him against Steve Rolls. Edgar's got to show that he can make it through this fight, but not only make it through it in style. If he is to be the Puerto Rican superstar...
If they want him to be the next face of Puerto Rican boxing, he's got to show he can smash a guy like this.
That's what he's got to do. He can't afford to go out there and have another Marcelo Coceres performance. There were a lot of people ahead of that fight that were already unconvinced of Edgar Berlanga.
And that fight didn't help convince them of anything.
For Edgar, they need to spend less time making highlight reels, spend less time on the bells and whistles, and spend more time on the boxing, because it is the boxing that's going to take him places, after all. In light heavyweight news, I don't like the sound of this. Joe DeGuardia says, I'm not going to sit around and wait for Beterbiev. I want Joe Smith Jr. back in the ring.
Now, why would you have to sit around waiting for Beterbiev?
Joe said, look, it's obviously a fight we want. It's a fight we've wanted for, 3 years? We've been trying to make that fight. We tried to make that fight before the Dmitry Bivol fight in March 2019, and Beterbiev didn't want to take it after they told us he was going to fight. So ultimately, if Beterbiev wants the fight, and if ESPN wants the fight, we can make that fight happen. When you've got fighters that want to fight, we're going to be able to make those fights happen. But frankly, I'm not going to sit around and wait for Beterbiev because I want Joe back in the ring. We've been out for 9 months, You've got a world that's surrounded with delays because of COVID and everything else. So when you have those kinds of situations and those issues, you don't want to be sitting around waiting. So, if we can make a deal with Beterbiev, then, let's make the deal. let's get together, let's do something quickly, and let's make a deal. And if not, we're gonna look for somebody else because I want Joe back in the ring. He should be back in the ring. He shouldn't be waiting around. There's too many things that can happen in this COVID world anyway, so I'd like to get him back in the ring.
I don't like the energy from Joe DeGuardia.
I gotta be honest with you guys.
It's a good fight.
Beterbiev versus Smith Jr. really is one of the more excellent fights that the light heavyweight division has to offer, but for Joe Smith Jr., it's not the biggest money fight that he can be involved in, and I think that's what Joe DeGuardia has in mind.
I think they're holding up for a Canelo fight is what I think.
That's who Joe Smith Jr. mentioned himself by name after the Steve Gerrard fight. Joe DeGuardia added, I'm not going to keep Joe on the shelf waiting for Beterbiev and make a deal with Beterbiev and then he pulls out, DeGuardia said. So those are all the factors in what we're going to do next. But if Beterbiev really wants the fight, and if ESPN wants this fight to be made, then let's sit down, let's get this thing done, and put it together. That's what it really comes down to.
I don't get the sense he's committed to the Beterbiev fight.
If you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do. No, I don't get the sense that Joe DeGuardia at this time is committed to the Artur Beterbiev fight because the Artur Beterbiev fight don't pay Joe what a Canelo fight could pay Joe. And Joe mentioned Canelo by name. Canelo, who we all know, is in the market for an opponent, and an official fight for him has not yet been announced. It's not written in stone. It's not set that he's going to go up the cruiserweight and fight the winner of Makabu versus Machunu 2. We don't know with an absolute certitude that that is going to be Canelo Alvarez's next fight. And what we have been hearing is that Canelo Alvarez has expressed some interest in a Joe Smith Jr. light heavyweight contest. I feel like Joe DeGuardia isn't committed to the Beterbiev fight because he wants to keep Joe available for Canelo. Let's be honest. Joe stands about as much chance of losing to Artur Beterbiev as he does to Canelo Alvarez. The difference is the price, the payday.
The problem with this is we don't know with an absolute certitude that Canelo's going to fight him.
On this premise, I would not immediately jump to the conclusion that Joe Smith Jr. and Joe DeGuardia are attempting to skirt around a Beterbiev fight. It all depends. It all hinges on whether or not they can get the Canelo Alvarez fight. If they get the fight,
then I'll understand.
But what's Joe saying? Joe's saying they're not going to sit around waiting for Artur Beterbiev. Well, who says you got to sit around waiting for him? He just fought late last year, and you were just in action this past weekend against Steve Gerrard. Both your dance cards are free.
Neither one of yous is booked.
Neither one of yous. Don't give me the balls in their court shtick. If you want the fight, you'd pursue it just as much as you're expecting them to pursue it. But what I see,
he wants to get Joe Smith involved in something in a hurry.
He doesn't sound committed to that Artur Beterbiev fight, and it's not a coincidence that very recently we heard Canelo Alvarez is expressing an interest in facing Joe Smith Jr.
That's not a coincidence.
The Beterbiev fight is a very risky fight for Joe Smith Jr. It's a risky proposition, and for running risks, you might as well run those risks with the fight that's going to get you the most money. In their eyes, in Joe DeGuardia's mind, I think, that's the Canelo fight more than the Beterbiev fight. We all know that. You don't make fighting Beterbiev what you make fighting Canelo.
But he's not going to come right out and say we're waiting for Canelo.
He's not going to come right out and say we're not committed to the Beterbiev fight that Joe Smith Jr. ahead of the Gerrard fight, the fight that he said he wanted, the Beterbiev fight. At this time, Joe's not going to say we're not committed to that fight because we want to wait for Canelo.
No, he doesn't want to take the heat for it.
He doesn't want his prized stallion in the light heavyweight division being accused of ducking and delaying unification matches on the premise that he just might win the Canelo Alvarez sweepstakes. He doesn't want his guy to take the heat for it. So he's going to use a lot of creative language like, well, we're not going to sit around waiting for Artur Beterbiev. But who says you got to wait? Both your dance cards are free.
Whether or not you consider this a duck is up to you.
For me, it all depends on whether or not Joe actually gets the Canelo Alvarez fight. If he gets the fight, then I wouldn't call that a duck. However, if he ends up fighting someone not named Canelo Alvarez and not named Artur Beterbiev, okay, then we gotta use the duck word. Then that's...
What are you supposed to call it?
And finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, told by Bob Arum that talks to make Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk via a Middle East deal with Dillian Whyte and Anthony Joshua stepping aside still ongoing now. He's far from optimistic, branded the situation as total chaos, and said he has no idea which of Usyk or Whyte will be next. And I think this much. I'm not confident that Dillian Whyte fight happens.
And I never have been.
Eddie Hearn chimed in on all of this, and he said there still is a desire from some people to try and get that fight together. I think the favorite right now is Fury versus Whyte, and Usyk versus Anthony Joshua too.
So we're getting confirmation of this on both sides.
It's not just one team saying that we might see a Fury versus Usyk situation. I'm not against that situation if Anthony Joshua is willing to step aside, though, is he? We're still hearing word from Anthony Joshua in reference to a second fight, a rematch with Alexander Usyk very recently. He was quoted as saying, "Next fight, I'm going to beat him, and I'm going to take those belts from him. I'm going to reign again to become a 3-time heavyweight champion of the world, whether people like it or not."
So does it sound like he's planning on stepping aside?
We're hearing all sorts of rumors and reports in reference to additions that Anthony Joshua is making to his corner, a trainer switch. And with these things in mind, I don't get the sense that Fury versus Usyk is a foregone conclusion, that it's in any way, shape, or form a foregone conclusion that Anthony Joshua will step aside.
I don't think this guy's in the market for a new trainer because he plans on stepping aside.
I don't think he's talking about becoming a 3-time heavyweight champion because his plan is to stand down, let those boys fight, while he steps aside. I don't think that's what the future holds.
At least it doesn't sound like it.
There is so much in reference to the heavyweight scene, the alphabet titles, those in possession of them, and what's happening away from the prying eyes of the boxing community, the community at large. There's so much happening behind the scenes, it's very difficult to get a read on what's going to happen in the immediate future. As stated, I've never been confident that Tyson Fury would ever fight Dillian Whyte. Though him not fighting Dillian Whyte doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be fast-tracked right into a Usyk fight. Maybe he fights Manuel Char, maybe he fights Robert Helenius in the in-between time while he waits. Those are names that are tacked on to Fury's next fight, guys that he might fight.
When it comes to Anthony Joshua's corner situation,
Look, I can tell you that something needs to change from the first fight, that the execution has to be different, that you can't go in there trying to box with the boxer.
No!
That's not going to work. You tried that already. But I can't tell you how encouraging that is or isn't until an official announcement is made, until we know more about who's going to be training this guy.
what's their track record?
I can't tell you how confident I am that Anthony Joshua might just become a 3-time heavyweight champion until we know more about his corner situation and who's going to be preparing him for this fight. At minimum, what we know, what we've always known, is that in all likelihood, in the second fight, he's going to be more aggressive. He's going to try to impose his size more, impose his will more. That doesn't mean that he wins the second fight, but that does seem to be what he has in mind, what he wants to do.
So is that ever a mystery?
Bob Arum described the situation at heavyweight as chaos.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Thus, it's hard for me to get a read on any of this.
I don't know what the fuck's gonna happen.